So welcome. Good morning, everyone, to another Consumer Duty Alliance webinar. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. First off, those of you with a keen eye may have noticed that we've changed the name of the forum to Consumer Duty Practitioners. It used to be the Consumer Duty Champions Forum. This is to reflect the fact that the kind of regulatory expectation for firms to have a consumer duty champion has been removed or relaxed by the FCA. And besides, I don't think it was ever exclusively a club for champions. So the key takeaway is that while the name may have changed, the focus of the forum has not. We're going to continue to seek, and we're keen on your feedback as ever, to offer practical support to members of the Alliance by sharing insights, experiences and good practice, and hopefully driving meaningful discussions around new ideas and innovations that can lead to tangible positive impacts for consumers and obviously for the businesses helping them. So that's the first bit of housekeeping. The second bit is we're having a couple of little technical issues with the tech that we've got doing this. So the slides are not as big as we would want them to be. Hopefully you can still read and make sense of them. But the good news is that you will have a copy of them at the end. So no need to strain your eyes or Scrabble to make notes on them. You're going to get those slides at the end. So that's where we are for now. What are we going to be discussing today? Well, the focus of the session sees us return to a topic that we've covered before. And I don't think that's an issue. It's backed by popular demand. It was the most popular issue that firms wanted to talk about. And I think there are a few reasons. That is the topic about monitoring, just to be clear. I think firstly, we're run up to the Consumer Duty Board reporting deadline. I say deadline, I think that's self-imposed for many in the sense that, they're sticking to the kind of July timing that the FCA's implementation kind of date created. So that focuses the minds of firms around outcomes monitoring and what they can say or what they can't say about what they're up to. I think the other, probably most important reason why we're returning to this is that we know that the ability to kind of find practical, proportionate ways to assess the quality of client and customer outcomes remains a key challenge for many business. So in this webinar, we're going to be getting into that. We're going to be looking at why outcomes monitoring is key. We're going to be talking a little bit about, I won't be, but our two guests will be, how firms could implement an effective outcomes monitoring framework. And then perhaps going further than we've done before, we're going to be looking to use some detailed case studies to try and, get into the kind of cold face of what outcomes monitoring looks like in practice and give you some practical insights into this and how that might be reflected in your own businesses. And as ever, we'll have time at the end of the session for your Q&A. So as we go through, please pop your questions into the comments via the chat section and we will get back to them. So that's what we're going to cover. I'm now going to talk about who we're going to be covering with. And I really am delighted, I know everyone always says that, but I genuinely am, to be joined by two very knowledgeable, may I say, captivating panelists to discuss the topic today. First is James Edmonds, Managing Director at Duty CX. Anyone who's met James or seen his output on LinkedIn will know he's a kind of leading advocate for improving outcomes for financial services customers, especially those with vulnerabilities. He's got over 20 years experience of focusing on helping firms across the sector differentiate commercially by delivering fair, transparent and supportive experiences, particularly for those who needs it most. And James speaks regularly on vulnerability, CX and consumer duty at major events, including at the recent Tysers Vulnerable Customer Conference. Welcome, James. You're on mute. Surprised you there. And last but by no means least is Martin Grimwood, Director at FWD Consulting. So Martin has worked in the financial services sector as a market researcher and consultant for the last 35 years. He barely looks old enough. That must have started very, very young, working with most of the leading providers of life and pensions, retail banking, insurance, and retirement income solutions. For the last 10 years, Martin's focused on consumer protection, working closely with the FCA to support their understanding of consumers, and his work has provided insights that help the FCA develop its vulnerability guidance and the consumer duty. And he now works with providers to help them implement the duty, understand vulnerability, and monitor client and customer outcomes, particularly for those with vulnerabilities. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you very much. I'll take the compliment earlier as well. I did start life and pensions in short trousers, so
excellent.
There you go.
And maybe in the future, with changes to the work environment, you'll be able to. We'll all be able to go back to short trousers again. But let's not digress on a particular hot topic of mine. So I'm going to do a very small bit at the beginning, set the context. We can move on to the next slide, please, Emma. And then I'm going to pass on to James and Martin to get into the kind of juicy content today. So my beginning here is just a bit of context. It's just to step back and, just before we go into the detail, just talk about, what the purpose of outcomes monitoring is, how it fits within the duty and firms' broader responsibilities. So I suppose one of the key things to say is that there's a clear expectation written within the duty requirements in Print 2A for firms to need to regularly monitor their customer outcomes. And that's across all of the duties, more detailed outcome requirements across the product service life cycle. So in terms of product service design, fair value, the way that customer communications function, and also the way that customers are supported on an ongoing basis. And I suppose with a duty that focuses on the need for firms to act to deliver good outcomes for customers, there's a consequence to this, which is that where firms identify things that perhaps aren't what they expected, they take action to deal with them. They learn from things and they improve their processes, and by implication, the outcomes for customers. That then feeds into two other bits. So elsewhere, firms also need to ensure that the duties reflected in their strategies, their governance arrangements, people policies, and control framework. So in terms of monitoring, there need to be effective arrangements in place to undertake that monitoring activity. And we'll come on to the various forms that can take. James and Martin are going to get into that. And once they've done it, ensure the outputs are seen by the right people. And again, as we said earlier, take action where issues are identified. And then the final bit, which we've mentioned, is that there's a stock take in the form of the board report, whereby at least annually, a firm's governing body needs to review and approve a report confirming whether the business is complying with the consumer duty obligations. And obviously the outcomes monitoring, the action taken and to be taken is a key part of that. So that's where we sit from a regulatory standpoint. And linked to all of that, there's three things to mention. Number one, if you don't have the data that you need to do it, then you need to try and close those gaps. And then the other bit is, data is nothing without analysis. So it's really important to ensure that you apply the resource, not just to collecting the information itself, but working out what it means. And then finally, that the right people are involved in doing that and overseeing it. So that's my preamble out the way. Now I'm going to hand over to James. James, welcome, to talk a little bit more about the benefits of outcomes monitoring and why it matters. James, over to you.
Super. Thank you, Michael. I think you might have had some problems with the sound. I think it's apparently resolved now. I'm talking and you're on mute, so hopefully that remains, but let us know in the comments if you do see anything. Thanks for having me, Michael, and great to have so many people on. Good to speak to you all as well. So as Michael said, I'm going to cover a few bits and pieces and then hand over to Martin. But firstly, being around why outcome monitoring matters. So I think the main point really is that Consumer Duty asks about more than just good intentions from firms. So firms need to prove they're delivering the right outcomes, not experiences. They're different things. I'll get onto that, and prove that they are delivering those. Prove being the key word, I suppose. This is especially important when it comes to vulnerable customers as well, who often, let's say, don't complain or are less likely to speak up. And certainly in my work at MorganAsh, we've seen how easy it is for harm to go unnoticed if you're only measuring satisfaction or complaints or churn, etc. So those internal metrics that don't really tell you about outcomes. Martin will get a little bit further into this, so I won't go too far there. But ultimately, by proactively monitoring outcomes, firms can early on spot signs of harm, reduce redress, and improve compliance, as well as improving the experience as well. Of course, what will that then equal is a reduced cost to serve. So resolving a problem after it's happened is always going to be more expensive than preventing it in the first place. And of course, it will prevent similar errors occurring in the future as well. So it's a better place for your organisation to be in, but a better place for your customers to be in as well. I think critically, from a customer experience perspective, by monitoring and acting on outcomes properly with those closed loop going back to customers when things aren't quite right for them, checking out things work for them well, and using the insight you can get from that to begin to build your customer experience and or consumer duty improvement program, customers are more likely to stay and recommend you. And really, in a world where it's hard enough to earn trust as financial services, this has real commercial value as a result. Emma, if we can move on to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So as I mentioned, probably onto what's my favourite hobby horse, really. A real key issue around consumer duty is understanding the difference between experience and outcome. So I've spoken to so many firms who would say, and indeed I've seen this acknowledged as being okay by the FCA at times, firms that are monitoring net promoter score, so they are having, or at least are able to prove they are delivering good experiences to customers, but they aren't necessarily delivering good outcomes. And they're very different things. So a good experience, a friendly call, quick service, polite tone doesn't mean that the customer is getting what they need to in terms of the service or the product that they have with this provider. And obviously, conversely, a bad experience doesn't always equal harm. So someone might have to wait on hold for a long time, but they still might get the right product, let's say. That's why we need to be able to separate the two and measure both. So having a metric whereby, or an approach and framework where you can monitor outcomes and experience is absolutely critical. And I don't see many firms having that in place. Again, a bit more Martin's area than mine, but we'll leave him to begin to speak about that a little bit more later on. So for vulnerable customers, though, this is even more crucial. So they might be a bit more polite or passive or unsure of what to ask. They could also be more likely to accept a poor outcome without realising it. And that might feel like I've made a couple of ungrounded assessments there, but I saw a study by an organisation called Roger Voice, who are an AI call captioning service, that found that 78% of customers with hearing loss abandon banking. Now that's incredible. So 8 out of 10 customers abandon banking. I appreciate that's not quite the area we're talking about today, but just key to understand that disengagement really can happen for vulnerable customers. So it's important to ensure that those things are being monitored. And again, at MorganAsh, we support firms by providing an objective and automated vulnerability assessment, automated best next steps recommended for the advisor based on that customer's vulnerability. So there are ways to make this affordable and to take out the unnecessary steps that exist and that can make journeys really painful for customers. So that data around the vulnerability, when it's linked to outcome monitoring, can give a much clearer picture of where the risks are for organisations, and then the outcomes of vulnerable customers versus non-vulnerable customers can be monitored as a result, which is a key FCA requirement. And again, those are maybe being monitored by experience at the moment, but they aren't being monitored by outcome at the moment. So it's really important to be able to look at the two of those things and to differentiate between them. Obviously, otherwise you're relying on subjective judgments, assumptions, incomplete information, which isn't necessarily the best way to be able to deal with those types of problems. So you can only fix what you can see, I suppose, is what I'm saying. And if we can move on to the next slide, thank you. This is just a little bit about the commercial return on investment of outcome monitoring. So a lot of firms I might speak to will begin to think to themselves, well, this is actually add cost in if we're going to get a supplier to help us out with something like outcome monitoring or vulnerability assessments. But really, it's not about just being compliant. I think there is a strong commercial case for this, which is illustrated by some examples here. So monitoring outcomes will build trust, and obviously trust is the foundation for commercial success, and certainly within financial services. So when customers trust an organisation and it's proven, they will stay longer, reducing your churn, spend more over time, and refer friends and family. And that's what we would call earned growth. So it's not marketing spend, it's earned growth, and comes from ultimately doing the right thing. Vulnerable customers are a key part of this, as well as customers that don't have characteristics of vulnerability. Supporting them properly means fewer complaints, more loyalty, and a better word of mouth. Again, very, very important. You've probably all heard of the concept of the purple pound. I must admit, I don't love that phrase particularly, but it is true to say that within certain groups of vulnerable customers, that they will have preferred providers, and those will be commonly known within those groups. At MorganAsh, we've seen how consistent outcome monitoring combined with resilience-based automated vulnerability management will lead to a real business impact. So it's not just about doing the right thing, but it's the fact that taking these approaches can actually begin to pay for themselves. So I'm going to hand over to Martin now, I think, and I will jump on mute.
Thank you, Michael and James. I think I'll start my session just going back to 2022 and the duty, and I'm sure everyone on this call has read this cover to cover, or hopefully you have. And the bit that we're talking about today is this quote on this slide, which is firms need to monitor and regularly review the outcomes of their customers they're experiencing in practice and take action. So Michael's laid that out in terms of what the expectation is. And I think for me, it's the experience in practice, which is the key element. And actually, if you then look at what the FCA ask in the detail, that's not quite right either. So what I'm going to try and do today is probably try and demystify some of that, give you a practical framework, but also show how that framework for consultants has developed over time as the FCA drip fed information to us through various reviews. So next slide, please, Emma. So this is going back to 2022, the Consumer Duty, Section 11, 11.33. Now, 11.33 lists the types of information firms may want to collect and lists them out. So really what the FCA is giving you there is a shopping list of things that you might want to consider. And let's think about, proportionality rule. Some of this may be relevant to advisory firms, especially small advisory firms. Some of it might not. It might be relevant more to the larger providers. But this is what they've done as a starting point. And really, within the duty, they didn't give firms a lot of guidance in terms of how to use that. And I think that's why there's been so much confusion. So what they have done is drip fed information to us as we've gone through. So I'm not going to go into any detail in this list because there's a lot in there. But the reality is what the FCA is saying here is there's data points that they would hope you're using, but also there are activities they're hoping that you will do that will lead to good outcomes. And that'll give you a clue for the framework that we're going to develop. So it's what you do and the impact of that activity on customer is what they're asking you to do within that big list of data points and activities. We'll go to the next slide, please, Emma. So over the course of the last couple of years, the FCA have provided guidance based on what they've seen firms doing. So the most significant piece of information that was dropped down to firms was in June 2024, just before you were writing your first board reports, when they actually reviewed how insurers had tackled the challenge or requirement to monitor outcomes. And what the most important piece of information that came from that review was what the FCA calls the causal chain. And Michael articulated that very well, saying you need structure, you need to identify your gaps, you need to see where there is harm or potential harm, and you need to improve what you're doing. So I'm going to take you through the causal chain because that's really central to what the FCA are expecting in the next board report, because that was what was missing mostly in providers and advisors reports that were submitted back in 2024. The other really important piece of information that was dropped down by the FCA was later in 2024 when they reviewed the Consumer Duty Board reports that were published that year. And what they found was that there was an over-reliance on intuition, and there was not enough data-led decisions, informed decisions. Now, I think we all know as consultants, everybody got away with that in year one, because we all saw the low-hanging fruit. When you start to think about how you've been supporting clients over the last decade, some of it, you in reflection, you think we should change that. And that's the intuition that the FCA saw in those board reports. What they're saying now is we want to see evidence-led changes that you're implementing. And I'll come on to that in a moment. And the final piece that the FCA dropped down was most recently in the vulnerability review, where they said, actually, what we're seeing through the way in which firms are monitoring outcomes is too much reliance on what we're doing ourselves that we hope will lead to good outcomes, and not enough evidence of the actual outcomes themselves. Going back to that piece where they're saying what they experience in reality. So what I'm going to do, hopefully very quickly, because I've got a time limit on this and Michael's already looking at me, is take you through a framework that we developed with the FCA. We sat down with the FCA and said, look, this is what we're advising to our clients. What do you think? And they said, yeah, okay, that looks good enough. Fabulous. That's all you're going to get from the FCA. So I'll take you through that now. So next slide, please, Emma. The causal chain is at the center of what we do. Now, I've put a slide in for this because I think it's important. I can't use my cursor on this, but on the red box on the far right, the first thing that the FCA say is, well, you've got to define what outcomes look like for your clients. If you haven't got that, you can't measure it, which is an obvious point. So you should have by now listed out the things that you believe are important to good outcomes for your clients. Once you've done that, you then need to choose a suite of metrics or activities that you religiously monitor and assess over time to make sure that you're delivering the outcomes that you set out to achieve for your clients. And as Michael rightly pointed out, where you identify harm or potential detriment, that's where you need to go into the weeds. You need to start thinking about, well, what's wrong? What can we improve? You then get that investigation and then you take action. And the final stage is to evaluate in that loop whether those changes that you've made have had the desired impact on outcomes. So next slide, please, Emma. The simplest way to articulate that causal chain in the framework in terms of good customer outcomes is, what are you going to do to monitor what you believe will lead to good outcomes? So that's the heavy lifting that you and your colleagues do to deliver good outcomes to your clients. Most of those initiatives should have a positive impact, but what the FCA is saying is that you have to measure that impact, and that's what James was saying. It's not whether they felt good, they left that meeting with you feeling positive. What do they do with the information that you provide to them? Do they behave the way you expect them to do? That's the bit that you need to actually monitor. And once you've monitored it, you need to reflect on that, as Michael said earlier, learn from that, and then change, and then go back into that cycle. So let's just go back to the next slide, Emma. So that big long list that I showed you from chapter 11.33 is laid out here. It's not exhaustive, but I've put it into groups so that you can see what falls into each bucket. So when you're monitoring what you're doing, it should be about the systems or data that you collect in terms of getting things out to clients on time, making sure they get an annual review if they're paying for an annual review. It could be call monitoring. If you're a larger advisory firm, you could have situations where colleagues listen into meetings with other advisors to ensure that actually they're doing the right thing. I'm sure you do that already. There's also testing of what you do. There's also training. James has spoken in depth about vulnerability. Getting training on vulnerability, how to spot vulnerability, is really important. So these are the activities that you do that you hope will then lead to good outcomes for all of your customers. Then you've got the bucket, which is measuring the impact. And there's some easy ones there. The easiest ones are employee feedback, talking to colleagues about their experiences, identifying potential harm. Distributor feedback, press your relationships. If you're an advisor, ask the distributor, the manufacturer, to share the data that they have on their customers. But there's some really hard ones to achieve here. And this is one of the things that the FCO started looking at. Customer behaviors, for example, really being able to evidence that customers are doing the right thing. Business persistency is hard as well, and we'll come on to that in a minute. And then finally, what you need to do in this causal chain is it becomes BAU activity, and you use all of that data and those observations to populate your board report. Next slide, please, Emma. Now, you can put that into a framework, and there's a lot of detail here, so I won't go through it in a great deal of detail. But the way in which we work with clients, we give them these types of pages to ask them to populate them so that they can check that they've got the right things in there to meet the FCA requirements. But also, as James said, make sure that they're actually delivering good outcome to clients, because there's a commercial element to that as well. So in this framework, on the far left-hand side, in that column, they're your good customer outcomes. So this is going to be for understanding, and how do you actually ensure that you're the way in which you communicate, both written and verbally on website, that clients can understand that and take positive action, that it's timely, that it's inclusive, etc. You need to be able to populate this table to say, well, okay, what KPIs are relevant for each of these? There may be none, and therefore you don't need to measure it, but there must be something in here that you use to ensure that how you communicate and what you communicate is understandable and leads to informed decisions. On the right hand side, on the middle point here, measuring the impact, again, what customer feedback, colleague feedback, complaints, root cause analysis, or behaviors do you have that you can evidence and monitor that the good things that you've been doing have led to a good impact. Now, I could talk for a long time on this, and I'm sure Michael's going to start using his blinking method to stop me talking. So if you do want any more detail on this, please drop me a line and I'll take you through it in a lot more detail. But it's a very useful aid. Now, the biggest issue is at the bottom there is characteristics of vulnerability. You've got to do all of that by looking at customers with vulnerability, which is the hardest thing. And that's where the FCA have said that they're not seeing enough of this over here. Final slide, please, Emma. So from the various reviews, what are the expectations from the FCA? What they're saying is that there's too much reliance on monitoring what we do and not enough focus on actual outcomes. I wrote down some stats from vulnerability review. What they said, the FCA said, well, 78% of firms are looking at customer feedback, which is great. 79% of firms are looking at complaints. They're the easy things to do, because complaints is retrospective and staff feedback is fairly straightforward. Fewer firms are looking at customer feedback, so only 49%. How can you incorporate customer feedback in a systematic way within your firm? And I know proportionality is difficult because you can't all afford to do large surveys, and sometimes you don't have enough customers to make it viable. But there must be some way that you build that in that's practical and pragmatic for your business. And the other one, which I think is the one that the FCA are going to come down on hardest, is behavioral. And only 36% of firms are actually sharing behavioral data with the FCA. And what that means simply, and we'll come on to this when I do give an example about understanding, is if you're asking customers to do something, what proportion actually do it? And if very few customers do what you want them to do, then there must be something wrong with the communication, because you're not doing it well enough. And that's why they want the behavioral piece, so that you can learn that the things that you're doing aren't necessarily achieve the outcomes that you want. And the final point in terms of going forward with your board report, there is an over reliance on intuition. There's not enough data-led informed decisions. So when you write your board report, if you're writing one this year, you need to get a lot more of this measuring the impact stuff in there and show how you're using that to go forward. Emma, over to Michael again.
I think it's actually back over to you guys, because we're going to get now into some case studies where we're going to put a little bit of flesh on the bones of what kind of outcomes monitoring might look like in practice in some specific scenarios. We've got three. We've got one on consumer understanding, we've got one on consumer support, and one on fair value. So I think actually, Martin, it's over to you.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do that. I'll be a bit quicker this time, Michael.
We're going full Chuckle Brothers for those in the audience.
Chuckle Brothers. Okay, so consumer understanding. Then I've put my hand up for that one. What I'm going to do, I'm going to use that framework that I've shown you, because I think that's the best way to bring it to life. So next slide, please, Emma. So my biggest bugbear at the moment, I lost Dad last year. Lasting power of attorney. My God, the communication that's coming out from government and from financial providers is so confusing. I consider myself pretty literate, but I've got on all occasions when I've been talking to providers, I've sent them the wrong information and it's delayed the whole process down. I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to try and do, because I know quite a lot of advisors are on this call, I'm going to relate my experiences and what I would do if I was a provider to change that communication for the better. So I behave differently. I get it right first time. I don't have that delay in taking control of mum's finances when she wants me to swap around various investments. So what I'm going to do, I've just taken this from top of my head. How can I relate this to possible reminder emails or letters that you send to clients who have paid for an annual review in their fees? So next slide, please, Emma. So let's look at what data we're going to use to tell us whether there's a problem or not. So this is on the right-hand side of the framework. So in behavior, you may find each year that, well, actually, only 75% of your customers that you send an annual review letter to are actually doing that, and you have to chase them. So 25% are missing what you're saying to them. They're not submitting dates for you to actually meet with them. So that could be a big problem given where we are with Consumer Duty and the review of charging structures. So we know there's an issue there. So if you go to the next slide, please, Emma. One of the things that you can do is say, okay, we've seen this behavior. Have we got any supporting evidence that will tell us, that there's something wrong? So it could be, in this case, feedback from colleagues, where colleagues are actually mentioning a rise in the proportion of clients who are coming to them a bit too late to make decisions. They should have had that conversation in the annual review, and what's happening is they're coming in quite panicked and quite urgent to meet. So there could be supporting evidence in that part of the data that you're collecting. The next slide, please, Emma. And also complaints. The FCA is saying, well, that's the most prevalent data that firms are using, 79%. Is there anything in complaints from clients about the fact that they've not had an annual review, despite the fact that you've sent out a letter to them or emailed them? Are they complaining that they're actually paying for that advice and not getting it? So there are 3 data points there that should alert you to a problem. This is what the FCA are asking you to do. Generate some insight on even on a small basis, and that's not a costly thing to do, so that you can start to put together a picture of what might be happening with customers. And if you've gone to the extra length of actually identifying vulnerable customers in your data, you can see whether that's more prevalent with those with probably, as they get older, they've got less financial capability. It could be that they're confused. Whereas 10 years ago, they were having those meetings with you, now they're not. So I think there's a lot to be done with a small piece of data. Next slide, please, Emma. So once you've identified there's a problem, thinking about that causal chain, you need to take corrective action. Next slide, Emma. So what you should be doing is reviewing what you're currently doing. So that's in terms of, what do our letters currently look like? Are we confident that they're going to get the job done? What can we change to make it clearer? Can we use plainer English? Can we be more bold about what we do? Can we use less words? Because, one of the things in the power of attorney piece, it just bamboozled me, the language. I couldn't see the wood from the trees in terms of what to do. So there are very simple things you can do as a firm to improve things. Next slide, Emma, please. And then there's the new stuff you can do. So audio, quite a lot of vulnerable customers who have cognitive challenges like to hear the advice that you're giving to them, or to receive an audio message to say, get in touch. We haven't spoken for a while. You're due an annual review. Let's talk. So there are other things that you can do, the activities that the FCA is saying, what are you doing that you will believe will lead to good outcomes? So once you've made those changes, next slide, please, Emma. In this framework, you've got to monitor whether they've had the desired effect or not. So again, next slide, please. Go back to your behaviors. Are customers behaving differently with the changes that you've made? And this is the causal chain that the FCA are talking about. It's fairly simple when you think about it. It's just that the FCA don't use the language that is necessarily that accessible. And final slide, please, Emma. And the other aspects of this, if you're looking at complaints, you should see a drop-off in complaints that are focused on the annual review, lack of contact, and paying for something that they feel they're not getting. So hopefully that was a fairly pragmatic way in which you can do that, around using a framework, using data, and then putting that into your board report. This is what we saw from customer feedback. This is what we did. This is the impact on customer behaviors. That's what the FCA are looking for in the next board report. Over to you, James.
Martin. Yeah, thanks, Martin. I think seeing that within the context of the causal chain is really helpful, because I think it's a useful and really salient reminder that there is that chain. So the question, the investigation, where necessary, the intervention, and then finally, the kind of assessment of, did it do the thing that it needed to do? And I think for me, with outcomes monitoring, sometimes the data doesn't tell you that something's clearly wrong, but it raises a question around whether something is right and you're delivering the outcomes. And often the solution is just to look into it and just tick it off. Nope, this is okay here. It's a false positive. But I think seeing evidence of that, including issues that are put to bed, like ambers that then become green, would be a positive thing. I know certainly when I was at the FCA looking at any kind of compliance monitoring or board reports, I wouldn't be put off by seeing ambers. It's good. It shows that some firms are able to identify stuff, and then, assuming you see the kind of right action taken, seeing the sea of green, it's not necessarily bad, but sometimes you think, oh, are the metrics there? Are the thresholds challenging enough? Are things being looked at? So never any harm in highlighting issues. Sorry, James, over to you.
Can I just jump in, Mike, before you do?
Yeah,
One of the things I would say, building on what you're saying, is it's advisable not just to have one data point for a good customer outcome. So you should have data points that kind of alert there might be a problem. You should have other data points that say, yeah, we can confirm there could be a problem here. So it could be behaviors aren't going the right way and you're seeing complaints. And then there's something else in there, which is more diagnostics. Why is that happening? And that's, if you've got at least 3 data points, well, if you've got 3 data points, you're in a really good position, because it's a triangulation and it gives you the answer and you can quite quickly go into solutions. Sorry about that. Over to you, James.
Good stuff. No, thank you both. I think some really good examples, and to your point, Martin, about needing more than one metric. So an organisation I was working at without giving up any names was using churn to show how they were delivering good outcomes and the customers were staying with them. But the reality was the experience that platform was offering was so bad that no advisor would go back to the customer and say, we actually need to move you out of this platform, because it took about 10 months to transfer out. So of course their churn is going to be high, which they think means good experience, good outcome to the customer. Absolutely not. It can be worse, and they also have pretty poor time for the advisor as well. It puts them in a bad position. And of course, any sort of advisor end customer relationship, you have to make sure the advisor looks good in front of their customers. So it's so important that the advisor and the financial services are able to work together on these types of things. And also, Martin, I say, if you're struggling to interpret those documents, then God help the rest of us. So I'm going to move on quickly and just go through our second case study, which is around consumer support. So one of the other outcomes, of course, and this really is about uncovering unmet needs in what I would call an inherited account. So the example is from a high net worth D2C stockbroker that I was working with, and shows exactly why going through the process of outcome monitoring matters. So the firm assumed that things were fine when one of their customers were to die, and they would leave a large amount of money to 2 or 3 people, let's say that person's children. After all, for the organisation, the assets were still there. But when we began to do journey mapping with this organisation, we were looking into the actual outcomes that they were getting and understanding the journeys that these customers were going on who had inherited the money. We were seeing that the clients weren't engaging. Many of them didn't understand the service or next steps, because they weren't as financially literate as the person who had taken out the policies originally or was doing the trading. And a lot of them were actually in a vulnerable state, of course, having recently lost a loved one. So the customers weren't understanding the position that they were in, and they were at risk of disengaging, moving their money, or even worse, simply losing it because of poor decisions. So by taking out some external help around consumer duty and looking at the journeys, beginning to do outcome monitoring, they were able to identify a cohort of customers that needed a bit of extra help. So they took some really simple steps. So a welcome call, a clear guide, some good staff training, as Martin mentioned, and then ultimately an offboarding process if needed for the customer. So the customer was able to go and get the right support, and they were placed into the right place for them. Again, thinking back to target market, for example, placed with an organisation who would be able to help out that particular customer given their circumstances. And this made a difference in engagement through the organisation with the employees as well as retention. So at MorganAsh, we often see the same pattern. So firms don't necessarily realise there's a problem until they actually start truly understanding customers and beginning to track outcomes properly. So I suppose, as a takeaway, really, it just shows that even well-run firms can have silent pain points that aren't understood until they actively go looking for them and proactively want to begin to drive out the right outcomes for their customers. So I'm guessing we might be back to you, Michael, for the next case study.
Yeah, for the finale. Yeah. Since I left the FCA and been working as a consultancy, I've had the pleasure, I'd say, of reviewing quite a lot of firms' fair value assessments, mostly in the retail investment space. So hopefully talking a little bit about what good outcomes look like, the kinds of things that you can use to kind of measure them in this context will be helpful. So I think the first thing to say is that the price and value outcome, it's not a race to the bottom of the price. The FCA has been at pains to say this. It's about value, and value is a comparison of price and benefits. So on that simple basis, I think there are two key bits that you need to do. The first is to focus on price, so on the charges. And I think what you're looking to do here, there are two things. I think there's initially the design of this. So we've got a charging model. Let's consider how we think it applies to our customer segments that we provide products and services to. So I think that's the kind of plan. But I think the important thing with price is that then there's the reality. And in the investment space, firms need to provide their clients with that data individually. You need to do your ex-ante costs and charges disclosure before you transact any business. And then you need to, report back in arrears, at least annually, on the actual costs and charges. So this is stuff that's already there. And so I think the firms that do this well have got that data in. They're looking at their prospective charges. They're considering how they apply across different client cohorts. So I think that's key here. And that could be either clients with lots and clients with less or a little. How do the charges affect each of those groups, particularly if there are some which might be fixed or, volume based, that could have a disproportionate impact on certain groups over others. And, the FCA's supervision notices that they publish show some really interesting and sometimes quite scary examples of where we've had, fixed charges on small investment amounts, creating and leading to really substantive and kind of self-defeating charging levels. So that's the first bit. I think the next bit is, as we said, to look at the actual charges. So plotting this as a distribution is normally really helpful to look at the range. And we've worked with lots of firms who, have a charging model that looks fairly sensible. There is a percentage-based charge. Maybe there's some kind of modular additional charge. You think that makes sense? We know roughly where that's going to be. We expect charges to be between X and Y. But when they've actually plotted out the charging reality across all of their customers, the distribution hasn't all been in the middle. There's been a bit of a tail in terms of people potentially not being charged enough. And when they've looked into it, maybe they've had people who've had kind of discounting run amok and that they've not realised, and potentially customers who are uneconomic to serve. So it's been helpful from a firm perspective. But then they've also had people at the other end of that distribution, whereby, for one reason or another, there are a small group often of customers who have been charging far more than they're expected. And I think having that reality there, the reality of the charges, and then being able to look into it is really key. I suppose the other bit about the kind of fees is that obviously as distributors, for example, advisory firms and discretionary managers, you're also often using other firms' products and services. And so it's important that you're looking at their fair value assessments, you're looking at their target market and then bringing that back in, those firms. I think the quality of those, industry facing materials, I think varies. And I think it's an issue that the FCA is aware of. I'm not too certain whether they're going to wade in to fix it. I think they're keen for the industry to self-correct. But I think looking at that, looking at the due diligence that's done in that space to form your panel and then reviewing it on an ongoing basis is really important. And I suppose the important thing for intermediaries who sit at the end of the distribution chain is that there's also an expectation under the duty to consider the total charges, many of which firms are in control of, in terms of, if you're designing your centralized investment proposition, your centralized retirement proposition, if you have one, you'll say, I'm going to use these platforms and not the others. I'm going to use these product wrappers and maybe not some others. I'm going to use these investment solutions. And then I'm going to have my own services on top of that, whether it's ongoing advice or discretionary investment management. And it's important to look at the totality of those charges, both at the design stage, but then again in that reality stage, just to see whether it stands in the way of people getting fair value. And at worst, the risk of some people suffering foreseeable harm. And again, within some of the FCA's communications, we've seen some examples of where the totality of that charges basically undermine the potential for the advice to deliver on the client's objectives, no matter how good it is, because of how the charges stack up. And then finally, there's an encouragement, isn't there, for firms to consider benchmarking their fees against others. And I think that's another important thing to feed in here. As ever with that stuff, it's about the quality of it. So genuinely, who are your peers? Who's a reasonable peer group? To what extent are their services a good match to yours? Are they doing less? Are they doing more? Do their charges appear in different ways? But I think that's a key component here. So that's the bit on the charging analysis. But then the important thing is that's not where it ends, because as we said before, it's not a race to the bottom on price. It's about value, and value is price versus the benefits delivered. So on the benefits, I think this is key. And I'd say a few things before we move over for questions. So number one, look at the benefits that you're offering to customers, but then importantly, look at the benefits that you're delivering. Martin touched really helpfully earlier around ongoing services. That's a fairly easy one to look at, isn't it? So, if one of the key elements justifying your ongoing advisory charge is the delivery of, say, an annual review, if that's what you do, then actually having the evidence to show that, number one, it took place. Number one, it was scheduled. Number two, it took place. And number three, that there was a kind of output from it that you can take account of as well. I'm not saying that you always need to be doing things for your customers, but confirming that things are suitable is a good outcome. And also showing activity that you've done is another way. You might have recommended customers make use of their tax allowances each year. All that is good stuff to show that the benefits have been delivered and that they are having a positive input on outcomes. Obviously, where there is a kind of performance dimension to this, so for example, we're talking about discretionary model portfolio, looking at performance, looking at the performance of the portfolio versus the benchmark, looking at the performance of the portfolio versus any internal thresholds that that firms have created for themselves. And we see some really good practice here where firms have, set themselves a kind of test to validate whether a certain product is delivering fair value, and then, nosing into it if they see those kind of ambers coming up. And then the final bit, and it links into what both James and Martin said earlier on, also look at those other quality metrics. They're really important, but as we said, they're not the only ones. So SLAs that you have around service delivery, it could be, if it's really relevant, the amount of time that people end up on hold, the amount of time that you take to transact something, platform switching times is another thing that's come up today. And it could be, customer views on the service that they're delivered, its impact on them and their objectives, their views on fair value are also really helpful too. But I suppose the key thing for me is that they're part of that framework of inputs to make the judgment, and they shouldn't be the sole one, because many customers just won't be able to kind of self-assess themselves as getting value. They might feel it, but I think there's a bit of work for firms to do in those other areas as well. So that's what I was going to say. Hopefully across the discussion today, we've given you a bit about the why, a bit about the how, and then some of those coal face examples. Yeah, feel free to get rid of the slides now. Thanks, Emma. And we've now got some time for your questions. I think I saw one come in earlier, so I'm going to find it in the chat, and it was a good one from Ian. And I'm going to put this one. Martin's off mute. So
I'll go for that one, because I've been reading Ian's message.
Yeah. Well, I'll ask it, and you can answer it. Let's recreate that Chuckle Brothers scenario. So Ian's asked, if you've got a client base-wide survey which is showing excellent results, but within that a tiny number of negative responses, are we required to take action with the outliers? And just for context, Ian says that his firm is a small advisory firm with 6 advisors. So hot potato, over to you first, Martin, and James, you get ready to add your input if you want to.
Well, I suppose I want to strike out the required bit, because that's we could debate that forever. But I would say, well, why wouldn't you? Because you've got data that suggests there's something not quite right, even though it's a really small proportion of your client base. But it could be a signal that others in that client base might think that, even though they're not articulating that in the survey. And just building on what Michael was saying there in terms of value, it could be the case that they're giving you a negative score when the reality is that they're not actually experiencing a negative outcome. What it could be is the way in which you're communicating. So my response is, yeah, I would look at those outliers because they're really important. The other thing as well is that some of those outliers are actually vulnerable customers, but you haven't identified them. We do research all the time looking at customer outcomes. We look at vulnerability in a very systematic way. And when you actually get into the weeds on the data, if you've got, let's say 7%, I'm not quite sure what you say a small proportion is, but 7% say negative things. When you actually look at vulnerable customers who have, say, financial capability issues, that could be 25%. So it's worth looking at them. It's worth saying, right, why are we getting this? And to Michael's point, if you discover, well, actually, they're getting a good outcome, there's nothing wrong here, then it's a simple solution. If you've identified them, get back to them, talk to them, understand why they're thinking that, reassure them, and then you've got a loyal customer. And I think that's the challenge, isn't it? So there could be something wrong. It could be an indication that things are wrong. You should investigate it, because it could be a wider issue. But if it's not, then you can easily resolve it, and you can then reap the benefits of having that communication with your clients.
James, anything to add to that?
Not really. I think that for me, that they would be the first people I'd speak to, and they will also offer you the most valuable insight around how to fix things going forward. And as we've discussed, if you can solve whatever problems it was that they experienced, then you're unlikely to have those again in the future. So, I agree with your point about the required part of the question as well, and not to pile in on Ian, but just to say, I suppose, but when it comes to the required part of it, showing you have gone back to the customers that didn't necessarily have the right outcome, that indeed will be a great point of proof to the FCA to show you have taken those actions and done the right thing from a compliance perspective, but also from a spirit of the duty perspective.
And I just add a little bit to it. So I think it's just that kind of proportionality overlay, which is that, number one, what's the nature of the negative response? Is it in that kind of even better if, or is it in the sense of this has gone or risks going horribly wrong? So I think the first bit for me is, are these negative responses substantive or not? And so when it comes then to saying, shall we take action? I think it comes to, well, if there's a low-hanging fruit that you can look into it fairly easy to look at what it is, then great. But in terms of what you do with that, I think it very much depends. So if it's kind of atypical and there's no significant impact on client outcomes, then maybe you might not need to take any action. If there is some pause for thought in terms of, I don't know if you guys could go on mute. I'm hearing that little bit of feedback that we had in the morning. Apologies. if you can make some changes to how you do things going forward and it's justified, then fine. I mean, the big thing that you're looking to discount is the fact that there could be like a significant poor outcome or at risk foreseeable harm where you'd need to take action, where you might need to do more. And I think as long as you could put it through that kind of sense check, if the FCA comes a calling, and you can show that, you've looked at things where there was good reason to, you did that scratch and sniff test, and where that showed some substantive things, you did some further. The FCA is not about, always, investigating everything to the nth degree. There is that proportionality bit in there as well. Right. Have we got any other questions? If not, I think there's one I wanted to talk about, which, and I'll put this one to you, James, first. Do you think, in terms of the duty outcomes and the monitoring that firms are doing, are the ones where firms are doing well, less well, and what can we learn from where firms are doing it well to try and kind of catch up in the areas where perhaps improvements can be made? Oh, you're mute. I'll go mute.
Always going to happen at least once, wasn't it? So I think that there are outcomes that are being monitored better than others. So I would say that consumer support is being measured well, or as well as it can be, using existing or historic metrics. I think that really is a legacy of the fact that the customer used to be owned by the contact centre, or that's how it's perceived to be owned within many organisations. So a lot of metrics already exist around how customers are being treated within that environment. So whether it's sort of first call resolution or average speed of answer, that kind of thing. So those outcomes, using those internal metrics, and of course you need a mixture of internal and external metrics, are much more a lot of those metrics already exist there, so it's a lot easier to measure. The outcome, I would say, I'm very much interested in yours and Martin's view as well, but the outcome I would say that isn't being correctly measured enough at the moment, or in a suitable fashion, would be around consumer understanding. So I think there, and again, we spoke about it earlier, didn't we? So Martin himself has problems reading some of the documents that he might get from financial service providers. Again, where on earth are the rest of us going to be if that's the case for Martin? And it's clear that these documents just aren't well structured enough. They aren't illustrative enough. They're not personal enough, and that there needs to be so much more done to understand, get customer insight against those documents, and make improvements. And it's not just a plain English, put a graph in. There are brilliant solutions out there that can personalise this type of communication, not necessarily a document, but this type of communication, to a level we just haven't seen before. And it's firms that embrace those types of solutions that will find they're saving costs when it comes to an old legacy approach, as well as delivering what customers really want, which is a much more personalised form of communication.
Agree 100% on the customer understanding bit. And we've had kind of other sessions, other webinars on this previously that have gone into it. Again, I'd bring it back to that proportionality bit, which is that, not everyone's going to be able to do the kind of A/B testing where you come up with two versions, you send it out to 1,000 people and you can do, look, that's going to be beyond the resources of many firms. So I think it's about people taking the steps that they practically can to do this. So in terms of the creation of these, structure, layering, plain English, avoiding jargon, all those things are fairly tangible and can be done. And you can show that you're doing them, and saying that you're putting it through some kind of tool, to try and remove jargon will be great. I think when it comes to testing, if you can't do the kind of more structured stuff, then building into your interactions with consumers, checking, understanding when you're delivering advice and going through suitability reports, having small focus groups with people to ask for their views on certain communications. All these things are accessible. And my sense is that the message from the FCA is that it understands that there's a bit of a risk with the duty that, in a move to get better outcomes, and some of these rules which, apply equally to the big banks and the big insurers as they do to smaller firms, there's a risk that everyone gets judged to the same standard. So I think as long as you can show that you're taking those practical steps within the context of what you do, and you've got those feedback loops in, then you should be in a good space. I'm conscious of time. James, Martin, any final thoughts? You don't have to say anyone. I just didn't want to cut anyone off. Martin's come back online. Martin, what do you want to say to leave us with?
Just go back to the framework, because you're talking about when you're looking at communications, you're looking at testing things, you're looking at changing things. That's the bit that you think will lead to a good outcome. Look at behaviors all the time, because that's where when we talk to the FCA, they are so hot on behaviors. All those other lists of information and activities are almost subservient to, if the customer doesn't act the way they should act, then that is where you should have a red flag and say, well, actually, why aren't they doing what we think they should do?
Brilliant.
That's my final
And
comment.
what a great way to end the session. Thank you so much to James, Martin. Thank you so much to you all for joining. Apologies for any technical issues. We will look into that for next time. I hope it's been helpful. We will share the slides. If there are any other topics that you'd like us to cover in the future, quickly put them in the comments. We'll also have other outreach to try and make sure that these sessions focus on what you want and need. Other than say, have a great day, and thank you for joining us. Thanks, James. Thanks, Martin. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.